Northern Montana, late October, 1887. The valley stretched cold and brown beneath the first dusting of snow, and in the middle of that emptiness stood something no one had seen before. A barn, rising around a cabin. Not beside it, not behind it, around it. People riding past would slow their horses, tilt their heads, and try to make sense of what they were seeing. Was it a cabin inside a barn? A barn swallowing a house? A mistake? Margaret Hartley didn't stop to explain. She had 3 children to feed, a winter coming that promised to be brutal, and a pile of problems that wouldn't solve themselves. Her firewood was soaking in every storm. Her cabin leaked heat through every crack. And every night, her youngest coughed in the cold drafts that no amount of chinking could stop. So she built something that made the neighbors shake their heads. Something that made the town's best carpenter call it the ugliest mistake in Madison County. They called it foolish, wasteful, dangerous, even. But when January came, when the temperature dropped to 30 below and stayed there for weeks, when every cabin in the valley turned into a frozen box that devoured firewood and gave back nothing but smoke and misery, her cabin stayed warm, steady, almost easy. And the number that silenced the entire valley? You'll see it soon enough. If you want to see how one desperate decision became a survival standard across 3 territories, hit that subscribe button right now. Because I promise you, by the end of this story, you'll be measuring the space around your own home differently. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's see how many of you are already thinking about building something over your house. Margaret Hartley hadn't planned to become a builder. She was 31 years old in the autumn of 1887, a widow since June, and the mother of 3 children under the age of 10. Her husband, Samuel, had been a steady man, a planner, someone who thought 3 seasons ahead. He'd started framing a barn that spring, 20 feet from the cabin, with plans to finish it by August. He didn't make it to July. Now Margaret stood in front of that half-finished skeleton of a barn, watching the October wind tear through the valley, and she did the math that every widow on the frontier had to do. She had 16 cords of firewood split and stacked outside, exposed to every storm. She had a cabin with gaps and the chinking wide enough to whistle through. She had a 6-year-old daughter who coughed every night from the cold drafts, and 2 sons who burned through firewood trying to keep a single room livable. Her nearest neighbor, a man named Cyrus Malone, burned through 7 cords of winter and kept his cabin at a barely tolerable 55 degrees. Margaret had been through 1 winter in this valley already. She knew what was coming, and she knew that 16 cords, exposed to the weather, half of it soaked, would never last. The barn Samuel had started was supposed to store hay and tools. It was supposed to stand beside the cabin, a separate structure, the way every homestead in the valley was laid out. Barn here, house there, woodpile between them. But Margaret didn't have the lumber to finish a full barn. She didn't have the time to build it before snow made construction impossible. And she didn't have the strength to haul soaked firewood from an open pile through 3 feet of January snow while keeping 3 children fed and warm. So she made a decision that no one in Madison County had made before. She moved the framing, not beside the cabin, around it. She repositioned every post, every beam, extending the barn structure so it enclosed the cabin on all sides, leaving a corridor of space 12 feet wide between the cabin walls and the outer barn shell. She used every scrap of lumber Samuel had milled, every plank she could trade for, and when she ran short, she used rougher wood, unplanned boards, anything that would close the gaps and create walls. By mid-November, it was done. A barn wrapped around a cabin, with a roof that covered both and a single door that opened into the barn space before you could reach the cabin itself. It looked strange, unfinished, like 2 buildings had collided and stuck together. Cyrus Malone rode past one afternoon, stopped his horse, and stared for a long time. Then he called over to Margaret, who was stacking firewood inside the barn corridor. "That's not a barn, Margaret, and that's not a house. I don't even know what that is." Margaret didn't look up. "It's dry firewood and a windbreak." Cyrus shook his head. "It's confusion, is what it is." By December, everyone in the valley had ridden past to see it, and everyone had an opinion. What Margaret had built wasn't elegant. It wasn't planned. And it certainly wasn't what anyone would call proper frontier architecture. But it was functional in ways that wouldn't become obvious until the temperature dropped. The structure worked like this. The original cabin sat in the center, a single-room log structure, 16 by 20 feet, with a stone fireplace on the north wall. Around that cabin, 12 feet out on every side, Margaret had erected a barn shell. For walls, rough-cut lumber, 8 feet tall, with a sloped roof that extended over both the cabin and the outer walls, creating a single continuous structure. The space between the cabin and the barn walls formed a corridor, 12 feet wide, open to the air, but protected from wind and precipitation by the outer barn walls and the roof above. That corridor became Margaret's woodshed, her cold storage, her workspace, and, though no one understood it yet, her thermal buffer. The physics were simple, even if no one in the valley thought in those terms. The outer barn shell blocked the wind completely. Montana wind in winter doesn't just make things feel colder. It actively strips heat from any surface it touches. A cabin wall exposed to 20-mile-per-hour wind at 0 degrees loses heat as if the air temperature were 30 below. But a cabin wall protected by 12 feet of still air and an outer shell, the heat loss drops to almost nothing. The corridor also kept her firewood bone dry. Every piece of which she'd cut, split, and stacked was now under a roof, protected from snow and rain, stored in a space that stayed dry even when storms buried the valley. Drywood burns hotter, cleaner, and longer than wetwood. A wet log can lose 50% of its heating value just from the energy wasted evaporating moisture. Margaret's was always dry. And then there was the door system. Instead of opening the cabin door directly to the outside, exposing the interior to a blast of freezing air every time someone entered, you now opened the barn door first, stepped into the 12-foot corridor, closed the barn door behind you, and then opened the cabin door. It was a crude airlock, and it worked. Every time Margaret or her children came inside, they left the cold in the corridor instead of dragging it into the living space. The barn roof extended over everything, with a small gap at the peak for ventilation. Smoke from the cabin chimney rose through the barn space and vented cleanly. There was no buildup, no backdraft, no fire hazard, just a column of warm air rising and escaping the way it was supposed to. To anyone looking at it from the outside, it looked like a mistake, like someone had tried to build two things at once and gotten confused halfway through. The barn walls were uneven. The siding was a mix of planed lumber and rough-cut boards. The whole structure had a slapped-together, make-do appearance that suggested desperation more than design. Cyrus Malone's wife, Helen, stood at the Sunday service in early December and made sure everyone knew her thoughts. I don't know what Margaret Hartley thinks she's doing out there, but that barn house thing, it's not decent. It doesn't look like a home. It looks like she's living in a livestock shed. The town's carpenter, a man named Raymond Poole, was even less charitable. Raymond had built half the homes in the valley, and he took pride in doing things the right way. When he saw Margaret's structure, he didn't hide his disapproval. "That's a fire trap waiting to happen," he said at the general store, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You can't heat a barn and a cabin at the same time. She'll burn through every stick of which she has by January, and when that fireplace finally sparks wrong, the whole thing will go up in minutes. And then what? 3 kids and a widow, frozen or burned. That's what happens when people try to reinvent things that already work." Margaret heard the comments. Everyone made sure she did, but she didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the windbreak, the dry wood, the airlock door. She just kept splitting firewood, stacking it in the dry corridor, and keeping her cabin warm with half the effort it used to take. And then November turned to December. And December turned to the coldest January Montana had seen in 20 years. The valley had a rhythm to winter, and everyone knew the steps. By mid-November, you had your firewood stacked, your chinking patched, and your root cellars stocked. By December, you stopped traveling unless you had to. By January, you survived. You kept the fire going, you rationed your wood, and you endured. But the winter of 1887 to 1888 didn't follow the rhythm. It hit early and it hit hard. By the second week of December, nighttime temperatures were already dropping below zero. By Christmas, The valley was locked in cold that didn't break, even during the day. And by the first week of January, when a thermometer outside the general store read 18 below at noon, people stopped pretending this was a normal winter. Margaret's barn cabin became a popular topic of conversation, and not in a good way. At the general store, where men gathered around the stove to thaw their hands and complain about the cold, Margaret's name came up constantly. Cyrus Malone said he'd seen her outside in the barn corridor, splitting wood in the middle of a snowstorm, and she hadn't even been wearing a heavy coat. "She's going to freeze those kids," he said, shaking his head. "Living in that mess of a building, trying to heat the whole thing with one fireplace. It's not going to work." Helen Malone was even more vocal. She told anyone who would listen that Margaret's children were too thin, too pale, and that it was only a matter of time before someone would have to step in. "A woman alone has no business trying to manage a homestead," she said at the church social, her voice full of concern that didn't quite hide the judgment underneath. "And building that structure, it just proves she's in over her head. A proper woman would have asked for help." Raymond Poole, the carpenter, was the most direct. He'd built a reputation in the valley as someone who knew construction, someone who understood how things were supposed to be done. And when he saw Margaret's barn cabin, he saw everything that was wrong with it. One afternoon in early January, he made a point of riding out to her property. Margaret was inside the barn corridor, stacking firewood, when she heard his horse approach. She stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. Raymond didn't dismount. He sat on his horse, looked at the structure, and shook his head slowly. "Margaret, I'm going to say this because someone needs to. That building is dangerous. You've got a cabin inside a barn, sharing a roof, with a fireplace throwing heat and sparks in an enclosed space. One spark lands wrong, and the whole thing becomes a furnace. You'll trap yourself and those kids inside with no way out." Margaret looked at him, her face calm. "The chimney vent's clean. There's no spark risk." Raymond waved a hand dismissively. "That's not the only problem. You can't heat two structures with one fire. You're wasting heat trying to warm a barn while your cabin freezes. You'll burn through your firewood by February. And then what? You'll be knocking on doors, begging for wood because you built something that doesn't make sense." He leaned forward in the saddle, his voice dropping to something that sounded almost kind, almost concerned. "I've been building homes in this valley for 15 years. I know what works, and this doesn't work. You'd be better off tearing down that barn shell and living in the cabin the way it was meant to be." Margaret didn't argue. She didn't explain. She just nodded once, said, "I appreciate your concern, Raymond," and turned back toward the barn. Raymond rode away, shaking his head, and by that evening, everyone in the valley had heard the story. The carpenter had tried to warn her. He'd done his duty, and if she wouldn't listen, well, that was on her. The women whispered at church. The men shook their heads at the store, and everyone agreed. Margaret Hartley's barn cabin was a disaster waiting to happen. But the disaster they expected wasn't the one that arrived. January 12th, 1888. The temperature had been dropping for days, but that morning it fell through the floor. By dawn, thermometers across the valley read 22 below zero. By noon, it was 30 below, and it stayed there for 3 weeks. The cold wasn't just cold. It was the kind of cold that turned breath into ice crystals before it left your lungs. The kind of cold that made cabin logs crack and contract with sounds like rifle shots. The kind of cold that turned firewood into currency more valuable than gold, because if your fire went out, you had maybe an hour before frostbite became a real concern, even indoors. Cyrus Malone woke on the 13th day of the cold snap and realized he'd burned through 4 cords of wood in less than 2 weeks. His fireplace was roaring from dawn until midnight, and his cabin was still barely reaching 50 degrees. His wife and children huddled near the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned, and the walls farthest from the fire had frost forming on the inside. He wasn't alone. Every family in the valley was facing the same math. Wood burned faster in extreme cold, but the cold was so severe that even a roaring fire couldn't keep a cabin warm. Heat escaped through every crack, every gap in the chinking, every thin spot in the walls. And the wind, bitter, relentless, 30-mile-per-hour gusts, sucked warmth from the walls faster than any fire could replace it. Raymond Poole, the carpenter, had built his own home with double walls and tight chinking. It was the best constructed cabin in the valley, and it was still losing. He was burning 6 cords a week, and his children were sleeping in layers near the fireplace because the back bedroom had dropped below freezing. At the general store, the conversations had shifted from complaints to genuine worry. Men stood around the stove, stamping their feet, talking about wood supplies running low, about livestock freezing in barns, about whether the cold would ever break. And then someone mentioned Margaret Hartley. Cyrus Malone had ridden past her place 2 days earlier, checking on his fence line, and he'd seen something that didn't make sense. Margaret's children, outside, playing in the barn corridor, in 20 below zero weather. Not for a few minutes, for over an hour. They were throwing snowballs, Cyrus said, his voice uncertain. In their coats, sure, but not the heavy fur coats. Regular coats. And Margaret was out there with them, splitting wood like it was October and not the middle of January. Helen Malone frowned. That's not possible. Those children would freeze. That's what I thought, Cyrus said. But they weren't freezing. They were laughing. Raymond Poole set down his coffee. She's burning through it faster than anyone then. She has to be. You can't keep a barn warm enough for children to play in. Not in this cold. But 3 days later, another rider came back with a different story. He'd stopped at Margaret's place, concerned, wanting to check on the children. And what he saw didn't match what he expected. Smoke from the chimney, yes, but not thick, roaring smoke. Steady smoke. Calm smoke. The smoke of a fire that wasn't working overtime. And when Margaret opened the barn door to greet him, the wave of warmth that rolled out wasn't the desperate, thin heat of a struggling fire. It was solid, steady, comfortable. She invited me in, the rider said later at the store. I stepped into the barn corridor, and it wasn't freezing. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing. Maybe 30 degrees? 35? And when she opened the cabin door, the heat that came out. He shook his head. I've never felt a cabin that warm in my life. Not in January. Not in this cold. The men around the stove went quiet. Someone finally said what everyone was thinking. How much wood is she burning? The rider shrugged. I didn't see a big stack going down. The corridor was full of wood, but it looked the same as it did in December. I don't know. Maybe she's just better at rationing. But rationing didn't explain warmth. It didn't explain children playing outside in deadly cold. And it didn't explain a fire that burned steady instead of desperate. Raymond Poole stood up, his face tight. I'm going out there. Someone needs to measure this. Stay with me, because what they measured next didn't just surprise the valley. It rewrote the rules. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because you'll want to reference this later. The number that came back from Margaret Hartley's cabin became the standard that 3 territories used for the next 20 years. Raymond Poole arrived at Margaret Hartley's homestead on January 19, 1888, with a thermometer, a notebook, and a determination to prove that whatever warmth people were talking about had to come at a cost. He brought Cyrus Malone with him, 2 witnesses, 2 men who knew construction, who understood firewood consumption, who could measure and record what was actually happening instead of relying on rumors and feelings. Margaret met them at the barn door. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem defensive. She just opened the door and stepped aside. Come in, she said. Measure whatever you want. The first thing Raymond noticed was the temperature change. Outside, the air was 28 below zero, cold enough that his breath froze in his beard. When he stepped through the barn door into the corridor between the barn walls and the cabin, the cold didn't disappear, but it softened. He pulled out his thermometer and held it up. 34 degrees. Not warm, but 62 degrees warmer than the outside air. In a space that wasn't heated. In a corridor that was open to the rafters, ventilated, with no fire, no stove, nothing but the secondary warmth bleeding through the cabin walls and the simple fact that the wind couldn't reach it. Cyrus Malone walked the perimeter of the corridor, looking at the firewood stacked along the walls. 16 cords, Margaret had said back in November. He tried to estimate how much was left. 13 cords, maybe, possibly more. In the middle of the worst cold snap in 20 years, 6 weeks into winter, and she'd burned through maybe 3 cords. 3 cords. Raymond was burning 6 cords every 3 weeks, and his cabin was barely livable. Margaret opened the cabin door, and the difference was immediate. Heat rolled out, thick and solid, the kind of heat that didn't feel desperate or forced. It felt easy, comfortable. Raymond stepped inside and stopped. The cabin was warm. Not fire-adjacent warm. Not huddle near the hearth warm. Warm. Everywhere. He walked to the far corner, away from the fireplace, and held up the thermometer. 68 degrees. He stared at the number. He checked the thermometer again, thinking it had to be wrong. But it wasn't wrong. The cabin was 68 degrees in the corner farthest from the fire, in the middle of a cold snap that was killing livestock and driving families to burn furniture just to stay alive. The fireplace wasn't even roaring. It was burning steady, clean, with a bed of coals that glowed orange-red beneath a few split logs. Not a massive fire. Not a fire that was eating wood as fast as you could feed it. Just a normal, controlled burn. Margaret's 3 children were sitting at the table, working on lessons. Not huddled near the fire. Not wrapped in blankets. Just sitting. Comfortable. Cyrus walked over to the fireplace and crouched down, studying the burn. "How often are you feeding this?" he asked. "Every 6 hours," Margaret said. "Sometimes longer at night. I bank it before bed, and it's still going in the morning." Raymond looked at her. "That's not possible. In this cold, a fire like this should die in 4 hours. Maybe less." Margaret shrugged. "The cabin holds heat. The walls aren't losing it to the wind. The corridor keeps the cold out. I don't know the science, Raymond. I just know it works." Raymond pulled out his notebook and started writing. He recorded everything. The temperature inside the cabin. The temperature in the corridor. The temperature outside. The size of the fire. The amount of wood remaining. The hours between feedings. And then he did something Margaret hadn't expected. He asked to stay. "I need to see this over time," he said. "I need to see how long the fire lasts. How much the temperature drops. How much would you actually use?" Margaret agreed. Raymond and Cyrus stayed for 12 hours, measuring, recording, watching. They watched Margaret bank the fire at 8 in the evening, covering the coals with ash, reducing the airflow, letting it settle into a slow, steady burn. They watched the temperature inside the cabin drop from 68 degrees to 63 degrees over the next 6 hours. They watched the corridor temperature hold steady at 32 degrees, never dropping below freezing. At 2 in the morning, Margaret added 3 logs to the fire. Not a full reload, just 3 logs. The temperature climbed back to 66 degrees within an hour. At 6 in the morning, Raymond checked the firewood supply again. Margaret had burned through maybe half a cord in 24 hours. Half a cord. Raymond was burning a full cord every 2 days in a cabin that was colder, less comfortable, and required constant attention. He closed his notebook and looked at Margaret. "How did you know this would work?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't. I just knew I couldn't do it the way everyone else was doing it. I didn't have enough wood. I didn't have enough help. So I used what I had." The barn frame, Samuel started. The space around the cabin. The idea that if I could keep the wind out, maybe I could keep the heat in. Raymond nodded slowly. He looked around the cabin one more time. Warm, steady, efficient. Everything his own cabin wasn't. "I owe you an apology," he said. Margaret shook her head. "You were trying to help. I understand that." "No," Raymond said. "I was trying to be right. There's a difference." He left that morning with a notebook full of measurements and a mind full of questions. By that afternoon, the numbers were all over the valley. 68 degrees inside. Half the wood consumption. 12-hour burns. A corridor that never dropped below freezing. The valley went quiet. Not the quiet of judgment. The quiet of people realizing they'd been wrong. And then, one by one, they started asking questions. Spring came late in 1888, but when it finally arrived, the valley looked different. Not in the landscape, in the homesteads. By April, 4 families had started building barn shells around their existing cabins. By summer, that number had doubled. And by the time the next winter arrived, 17 homesteads in Madison County had some version of what people were now calling the Hartley system. It wasn't always a full barn. Some families built 3-sided windbreaks. Others built smaller corridors, 6 feet wide instead of 12. But the principle was the same. Create a buffer between the living space and the wind. Store your firewood dry and close. Use still air as insulation. Raymond Poole became the valley's leading advocate for the design. He didn't just apologize to Margaret. He studied her structure, measured it, documented it, and started incorporating the principles into every cabin he built. He added thermal corridors to new construction. He retrofitted existing cabins with outer shells. And he made sure everyone knew where the idea had come from. Margaret Hartley didn't invent physics. He told people at the general store. She just stopped ignoring it. Wind steals heat. Wet wood wastes energy. Thermal mass holds warmth. Those aren't new ideas. We just weren't using them. Cyrus Malone built a windbreak barn around his cabin that summer. It wasn't as large as Margaret's, but it followed the same design. Outer walls, dry firewood storage, and airlock entry. The next winter, his wood consumption dropped by 40%, and his cabin stayed warm enough that his children stopped coughing. Helen Malone, who had been one of Margaret's loudest critics, came to visit in November of 1888. She didn't apologize directly, but she asked questions. How far should the outer walls be? How high should the roof go? Should the corridor be vented? Margaret answered every question. She showed Helen the firewood stacks, the door system, the way the thermal corridor worked. And when Helen left, she was already planning her own version. The design spread beyond Madison County. By 1890, homesteaders in Wyoming and the Dakota Territories were building barn-over cabin structures, often with regional variations. In areas with heavy snow, they built the outer walls stronger to handle snow load. In areas with extreme wind, they built the corridors wider. But the core principle remained. Protect the living space from wind, keep the firewood dry, use still air as a thermal buffer. Margaret never sought credit. She didn't write articles or give lectures. She just kept living in her barn cabin, raising her children, and answering questions when people asked. But the Valley didn't forget. When the Madison County Historical Society was formed in 1912, one of the first structures they documented was Margaret Hartley's barn cabin. By then, it had become a landmark, a teaching example, a piece of vernacular architecture that had saved lives and changed how people thought about frontier survival. The historical record from 1889 includes a letter from a homesteader in Wyoming, written to a friend back east. Saw the strangest thing here: cabins built inside barns or barns built around cabins, depending on how you look at it. Locals say it started with a widow in Montana who got mocked for it, then proved it worked by staying warmer on half the firewood. I'm building one this summer. If it keeps my family warm the way they say it does, I'll build one for you too. The technique worked because it respected principles that modern builders would later formalize: thermal breaks, air barriers, protected storage, and heat retention. But Margaret didn't need the terminology. She just needed her children to stay warm, and she was willing to look foolish to make that happen. Raymond Poole said it best years later when someone asked him what he'd learned from the barn cabin winter. "I learned that looking right and being right aren't the same thing," he said. Margaret's structure looked wrong. It looked like a mistake. But it worked because she understood something the rest of us had forgotten. You don't beat winter with fashion. You beat it with physics. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is build something ugly that works instead of something pretty that doesn't. Margaret Hartley lived in that barn cabin for 32 more years. She raised her children there, saw them grow and start families of their own, and watched as the structure she'd built out of desperation became a standard for cold climate survival. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't trying to revolutionize homesteading. She was just trying to keep her children warm with what she had. And in the end, that was enough. Because the best solutions aren't always the ones that look right. They're the ones that work when everything else fails. Drop a comment and tell us. Where are you watching from, and what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? And here's the real question. If you could go back and redesign your home for extreme cold, would you build a barn over it? Subscribe, because next week we're diving into the story of the underground cabin in Wyoming that stayed at 55 degrees Fahrenheit year-round with zero heating, and the engineer who got laughed out of town for suggesting it. You won't want to miss it. That's frontier wisdom, not fashion, physics. Educational note: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.